folks, this is Andrew Crocker, and when we talked in Chapter 2, which again, I want to stress Chapter 2 is really one of the most important chapters in this textbook, but we mentioned in Chapter 2 the 4 pillars of the Constitution, and the second of those pillars was called federalism. Now, federalism is not real intuitive to us. It's not like later on we'll talk about Congress, and we know what Congress is, right? We can point to Congress and say that's Congress, but federalism is an idea, it's a concept, and it's a concept that you probably weren't too familiar with prior to taking this class. So, Chapter 3, you may have noticed, was a bit of a difficult read, and that's because, again, federalism is not terribly intuitive. It's not something that is super obvious, something that is super even exciting that much, really. And so let me ask you a question right now, and make sure you don't obviously need to answer this since I can't hear you, but answer this in your head. Do you know what federalism is? If I asked you right now, what is federalism? What would be your answer? Now, if you don't know off the top of your head what that answer is, here's what you do in the future. You think of that upside down triangle that you're looking at right now. This is what federalism is in a picture. Now, you see 2 things in this upside down triangle. First of all, you see that different levels of government are divided up. For instance, we have a federal government that deals with national issues. It's also called the national government. We have a national government that deals with national issues. So it'll deal with foreign policy, how we deal with other countries. Or it'll deal with building highways across the country. Or it'll deal with providing health care for everybody. Or setting education policy across the country. Then you have state governments, and they'll deal with statewide things, like what do we want the minimum wage in that state to be? Or what do we want abortion law to be? Building state roads from city to city. You get the idea. So, we have what should state tax levels be? So we have a state government that deals with state level things, and then you'll have local governments that will deal with local things. What stop signs should be in what neighborhoods? Should restaurants in your neighborhood allow smoking or not? What should the age range be for tobacco usage? You get the idea, right? So you have a federal government that deals with federal issues, state governments deal with state issues, and then local governments deal with local issues. Now, you'll also notice an arrow, right? And that's because in federalism, the power arrow flows down. The upper governments can tell the lower governments what to do. So the federal government can tell these other 2 state governments what to do, and the state governments can tell the local governments what to do. They won't always do that, but they can if they need to. So 2 things, if you don't know what federalism is, think of this upside down triangle and the 2 things it's telling you. Different levels of government will deal with different levels of problems. Federal government will deal with federal problems. State governments will deal with state problems, and so on. And then the power arrow flows down, so the upper governments can tell the lower governments what to do. Now, since we have that concept in mind, let me give you an example of how federalism can operate. For instance, back in 2010, something called Obamacare, we've nicknamed Obamacare, was passed. It's called the Affordable Care Act. It's called Obamacare. Now, it did lots of things, but one of the things it did was mandate that the states expand Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor, to everybody who lives in their states who is either in poverty or near poverty. So in other words, everybody up to the federal poverty line. Okay? Everybody up to the federal poverty line, whatever that happens to be. Even people slightly above the poverty line get Medicaid access now. Because prior to the Affordable Care Act, states could choose their own Medicaid levels. They could say, if you're at the poverty line, you're still too rich to qualify for Medicaid. And so you have to be not poor, but like dirt poor in some states, right? So the Affordable Care Act says everybody should be, all 50 states should have the same level of Medicaid qualification. Now, the states themselves said, wait a minute, we don't like that idea at all. We like to choose who qualifies for Medicaid and who doesn't qualify for Medicaid. And they challenged the case in front of the Supreme Court of the time. This was the Supreme Court back in 2010. Now, the Supreme Court ruled, or SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, it ruled in favor of the states. It said that the federal government can't mandate all 50 states accept the Medicaid expansion. Instead, the states themselves could decide to opt into this Obamacare mandate or opt out of it. Missouri, which I'm lecturing you from, has opted out of it. So Missouri, if you live in Missouri and you're at the poverty line, you are still too wealthy to qualify for Medicaid in Missouri. Most states have opted to be in Obamacare and therefore have expanded their Medicaid. This is an example of the state governments fighting the federal government over responsibility. Now, again, let's make sure we understand what federalism is. That upside-down triangle I showed you earlier, this is the upside-down triangle. Let me say that again. This is the upside-down triangle in word form. The federal government has ultimate authority, and it governs on national issues. So that's the upside-down arrow that you saw. The arrow points downward. The federal government has ultimate authority. But also, it just governs on national issues, and it leaves the state and local governments to deal with state and local matters. This is federalism in a nutshell. So that should be easy enough to remember. Now, this is pretty messy business. Don't get confused. I mean, if you're sitting there and you're like, well, health insurance, should that be a state responsibility or a federal responsibility? I don't know. Well, join the company. The states and the federal government argue all the time over what powers belong to who. So if you're confused over what levels the government should deal with certain issues, you are not alone. The governments themselves argue over it in front of the courts. Now, federalism is what happens when you try to compromise between two different government extremes. One government extreme is called the unitary system. And this is where, again, the phrase unitary should tell you what we're talking about. And the unitary system is when you have one government ruling the entire land. In other words, one government, one powerful central government, and really virtually no states or subdivisional governments to speak of. So you have an entire country run by a single federal government. It's all federal. It's all federal. Now, we don't really have that many examples of unitary systems, but like you can find some unitary systems on the planet in like very small countries. If you ever look at like the Vatican or Liechtenstein, these countries are so small you can't really split them up in the states. So you really just have one government running the show. It's called a unitary system. Now, in addition to that, the other extreme is called a confederation. And this should be ringing bells for you folks. We talked about confederations in Chapter 2. And confederations, as you probably remember, is when states control themselves. And the national government or the federal government can't really force them to do anything without their approval. Remember, we were talking about how that means strong states and a weak central government. That's what a confederation is again, states control themselves. Now, there really aren't any confederation examples in the world. You have to go to like international organizations like the United Nations, for instance. The United Nations is like a club of 190 different countries across the world that all work together and talk to each other and cooperate and cut deals with one another. That's the United Nations, but the United Nations can't force its member countries to do anything. So that's a confederation. Even though it's not a country, the United Nations as an international organization is a confederation. It can't make the United States, for instance, do anything. If the United States does anything through the United States, through the United Nations, it's because it's agreed to do so. That's a confederation. So federalism is trying to split the difference here. Federalism is trying to maintain a strong central government like you have in the unitary system, while allowing for lots of state-to-state variance based on regional preferences. So I don't know if you've ever lived in a coastal state versus a Midwest state, but if you've ever I lived in Connecticut when I was a kid, and living on the coast is completely different, folks, than living in the middle of the country like I do right now. And many of you have probably had similar experiences. And so that's what federalism does. It does allow for cultural differences from state to state. But it also does have that strong central government that can kind of call the shots. So it's got a mixture of unitary and confederation. And that brings us to the most important question of Chapter 3. Maybe the biggest conversation of Chapter 3. How should American federalism work, folks? How should American federalism work? Now, this is a should question, so there's no right answer. There's different preferences, perhaps, but there's no right answer as to how American federalism should work. There are competing theories, however. Now, one theory is called dual federalism. In other words, layer cake federalism. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But dual federalism is when that line that you have between state governments and federal governments, it's like a fence, and neither side can cross the fence. So you have state governments and federal governments. They're basically co-equals, and they never interfere in each other's spheres. The state governments are just as powerful as the federal government. So while the states may not mess with federal issues, the federal government will not mess with state issues. So your federal government generally will just end up doing less stuff. Now, this creates a competitive power dynamic where the federal government wants to do certain responsibilities that the states also want to do, and so they'll wrestle each other over who gets to do what. And folks, think of this. If this is a system where you have stronger states and a federal government doing less things for less people, do you remember from Chapter 1 what this might be ideologically? Be more conservative. It's a more conservative idea because, again, you're restraining your federal government more and allowing the states to do more. So that's one theory, is dual federalism. When somebody asks, how should federalism work? Some people, dual federalists, might say this. Conservatives might say this. However, there's also cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism is also known as marble cake federalism. We'll talk about that in a moment. But cooperative federalism, as the name implies, is when the states and the federal government cooperate. They intermingle. They work together to solve problems rather than staying on their own separate sides of the fence. So you have a federal government that has the ability to intervene in state matters now. And you have states that this really is just a one-way road. States don't really involve themselves in the federal government as much, but the federal government will intervene in state matters more and more aggressively. Therefore, you'll have more restricted states, and the federal government will be doing more things. Now, this, instead of being a competitive power dynamic like it is under dual federalism, think of that. Think of like a duel, like two people with swords dueling each other. That's a competitive dynamic, right? Well, under a cooperative dynamic, under cooperative federalism, it's a much more cooperative power dynamic. You'll have these two sides working together more often. Now, if you're going to have a federal government doing more things for more people, this is going to be a more liberal idea, sometimes called progressive. Liberal and progressive are kind of used interchangeably in the 21st century. But nonetheless, if you're going to have a federal government doing more things for more people, this is generally going to be a more liberal idea. So if you talk to a conservative and you say, hey, how should American federalism work? They'll give you kind of a dual federalism spiel. You have a federal government doing federal things, but it should leave the states alone. Liberals might say something along the lines of cooperative federalism. Well, they'll say, well, you have a federal government that runs things, and if need be, it can help the states in providing certain things. Now, we often nickname dual federalism layer cake federalism because, this looks like it's very straight lines. You're building a straight line fence between the federal government and the state governments, and they're not really mixing it up at all compared to cooperative federalism, known as marble cake federalism, where you'll see the federal government and the state governments swirl together in providing services for people. So this may be straightforward enough. And if you ask a conservative, they'll give you some version of dual federalism. You ask a liberal, they'll give you some version of cooperative federalism. But let me ask you this, folks, or at least let me say this. Who cares? Who cares what conservatives say about how federalism should work? Who cares what liberals or progressives say about how federalism should work? They're just trying to sell you on a bill of goods, right? So instead of worrying about what conservatives or liberals say, let's just look at the Constitution itself. Which side, dual federalism or cooperative federalism, do we read the Constitution as supporting? Well, this is just one of those areas where the Constitution is not actually going to settle the matter for you, folks. It's actually going to frustrate you because the Constitution ends up supporting both. What? Yeah, the Constitution, if you read it at different points of it, actually supports both dual federalism and cooperative federalism. Let me show you. So, first of all, later in the Constitution, you'll read the 10th Amendment. And folks, in quotes here, this is what the 10th Amendment actually says. And I'll never ask you to know what the 10th Amendment is saying. So you don't need to know exact language of the 10th Amendment, but you do need to know what it means. What is the 10th Amendment saying? I won't ask you to know actual language, but I do expect you to know what the 10th Amendment is saying. First of all, here is the actual language. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Folks, what this means is we are giving certain powers to the United States. In other words, we are giving certain powers to the federal government in the Constitution. And if a power isn't explicitly given to the federal government, it belongs to the states. Now, this creates a pretty obvious fence, right, between the federal government and the states. The federal government can only do that which is outlined in the Constitution. Everything belongs to the states. You're not going to get a lot of cooperation between these two levels here. And really, this is a more dual federalism type power structure that is being suggested in the 10th Amendment. So that should be the end of the conversation, right? 10th Amendment seems to clearly support dual federalism, and therefore the Constitution clearly supports dual federalism. End of the story. Well, not so fast. Because in Article 1, Section 8, we have a different clause called the Necessary and Proper Clause, or also known as the Elastic Clause. And this clause here says that Congress, in other words, the federal government, has the ability to make let me say that again. Congress, in other words, the federal government, has the power to make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution powers vested by the Constitution. And what that means is the federal government can do anything so long as it's necessary and proper for it to do. Necessary and proper, think about that. What's necessary and proper mean? Ultimately, it can mean anything. And so as a result, the federal government can use the Elastic Clause to dip into state matters all the time, really taking that line that separates the federal government from the states and stretching it like an elastic band deep into state responsibilities and deep into state matters. And so this clearly favors cooperative federalism, marble cake federalism, because thanks to the Elastic Clause, you can have the federal government and the states working together on a whole multitude of issues so long as the federal government deems it necessary and proper for it to do so. So the Constitution really supports both dual and cooperative federalism. Make sure you know the parts of the Constitution that support both sides, and make sure you know what they're saying, even though I will never ask you to recite these parts of the Constitution to me, word for word. Okay, so with that in mind, I've told you now that the federal government and the states are constantly tangling with one another over who gets to do what. But folks, despite the fact that these two sides do fight, ultimately the federal government has the downward arrow in its favor, and it has power over the states. And there's really two significant ways it can enforce its wills on the states to get the states to do the things that the federal government wants them to do. The first of these is money, specifically grants. The federal government can sprinkle money on the states and kind of make them dance for their supper, right? So, or what's that phrase? I think it's sing for your supper. So it can make the states sing for their supper. Now, grants come in different forms. There are categorical grants, and these categorical, let me say that again, these categorical grants are when the federal government will give money to the states with strings attached, saying, here's money, states. But if you're going to take the money, you got to do this specifically with it. And I'll give you an example. Under the Obama administration, there was something called Race to the Top, and it gave like 40-some states money for education. And it said you could only spend this money on education, states, if you improve the technology you have in classrooms. That's a categorical grant. That's money given from the federal government to the states, since the federal government has a lot more money than any state. And force the states, if you're going to take the money, you got to do this with it. So that's one way it can get the states to act. It's more of a liberal idea because it's more like the federal government dictating to the states. Now, you do have block grants. That's a different kind of grant. And this is a more conservative idea. This is when grants are generally intended for a general area function. So this would be like if the federal government gave states money and said, here you go, just spend it on education. Right? So that's very general. That can mean anything so long as it involves education. And it allows the states to ultimately decide how to spend it. It's a more conservative idea. And neither one's right, neither one's wrong. It's just different preferences. But this is a way that the federal government can get the states to do their bidding, is dangle money in front of them. Now, another way is that the Constitution allows the federal government to just boss the states around using legally using the Supremacy Clause. And it can force states to enact their will. Now, the Supremacy Clause means the federal government can force states to do something, what we call a mandate. That's when they force states to do something, such as expanding Medicaid, for instance. Or it can prohibit the states from doing something. So it can ban states from talking about religion in the classroom. Right? So that is the federal government telling the state governments not to do something. So these are two powerful ways that the federal government can make states act. Now, with that in mind, federalism, let's make sure we understand. Federalism is a pretty strong method of operating your government. It's not quite the unitary system. It's not quite confederations. And it served our country relatively well over the last 200 whatever years. So let's talk about some of the strengths of federalism. Now, first of all, what it does is it allows the country that flexibility to respond to national problems and crises on national scales. If we get invaded, you need the national government, not the states, but the national government with its superior resources to respond. Or if there's a hurricane that wipes out the eastern seaboard, you need a national government, not like a state or two, to fork over the tens of billions of dollars that may be needed to repair. States don't have that kind of money. The federal government does. In addition to that, while it allows for a powerful national government to respond to these crises, it also allows for regional differences. And this gets back to the point I was making earlier. You do have local cultures. I mean, living in Missouri is completely different to living in California. Living in Utah is very different than living in Minnesota. Living in Florida is very different than living in Alaska. And thanks to different states, thanks to all these different states having the ability to enforce their own regional laws and cultures, you can really have the great variety from state to state that we enjoy here in America. It also allows for something called state-by-state experimentation. And make sure you understand what I mean by that, folks. Make sure you understand state-by-state experimentation. What I'm saying, there's an old phrase about democracy. It says that the states are the laboratory for democracy. And what this means is different states will experiment with different policies. And if these states succeed with those policies, other states will look into it. Missouri has one of those, something called the Missouri Plan, how we select our judges. You'll learn a little bit later this semester about that here in a few weeks. Of course, that works the other way. If the state adopts a policy and it turns out to be atrocious, like maybe you would adopt a tax cut, but it bankrupts your government, maybe other states will say, oof, that we definitely don't want to adopt that tax cut. It'll bankrupt our government. Sometimes, if a state tries something and it's really popular and it works out really well, the federal government can adopt that state policy. Matter of fact, that's what happened with quote-unquote Obamacare. Massachusetts had a healthcare system that looked a lot like the Affordable Care Act, and it worked out really well, insured almost everybody in Massachusetts, and so the federal government, under Obama, adopted it through Congress. So this is federalism in a nutshell. I hope this took a difficult concept for you and made it easy to understand. If you have any questions, as always, please shoot me an email. Thanks, guys.